Is there a geography? And then maybe all the way down on the commercial side or even consumer side if we're talking residential mortgages to a loan-to-value ratio. So I think that we would expect financial services organizations to be a little bit more complex in the way they want to do that, since that's how they're pricing their receivables, and that's very important to how they run their business. But to a certain extent, I would encourage other organizations outside of banks, let's say, to really dig a bit deeper into the way that you're pooling, to once again really understand the types of receivables you have and the types of risks that you have. Because if we get to the end, you're gonna have to talk about that in your disclosures, and we'll still see, what the SEC's expectations are, what the auditor's expectations really are, and how the guidance is applied. But there are more robust disclosures that no matter what type of organization you are, we want the reader to really understand the credit risk in your portfolio.
Yeah, good point. I mean, you can see some of the types of risk characteristics. These are not by all means all inclusive,
right?
But I think a good thing to think about here is working with the credit department at your entity. How are they evaluating risk, even when they're entering into new agreements with short-term customers where you're not going to have a loan? How is your credit department looking at the risk of that customer? That may lead you down the path as to how you delineate or pool your assets.
Right, and this could be leveraged upon hopefully some of the improvements that were made from the application of RevRec and 606, that people were challenging the way that the sales were taking place and the contracts were being originated, and hopefully some of those improved processes for consistency can also be used to help you develop the pools for your trade receivables as well.
Yeah, and thinking about short-term receivables, I think one thing to keep in mind is this will be one of the hyper-focused areas for the auditors, because it's one area where you can really dig in and get a very pointed estimate if you have the right historical data, which we'll talk about in the future. So there's one thing to think about if you're an entity out there that only has the short-term trade receivables. Really keep in mind that this area is an area that you can actually save yourself some time by really refining that estimate and multiple risk characteristics within your portfolio.
Unless you're some small company with really one product generating your revenue, I would say that you need to at least go, aging would be a place to start, and that's fine, but breaking it down by at least one more risk characteristic is what the expectation will be going forward.
Yep, perfect. So we'll jump into the second here, so that, there's a lot of judgment involved, as you said, within CECL. ASC 326 allows that, but maybe talk about some of the methods that ASC 326 talks about for actually measuring losses here.
And I'm going to talk about this quickly, even though we can do a whole webcast on this one, but I'll talk about the ones that are more applicable since we're pressed for time. And I'll start on what we'll call maybe the low complexity and the loss rates. And there are various ways to do a loss rate, but a simple way would be just to think about what are your actual losses or charge-offs or whatever you want to call it, bad debt expense over time, given the average balance that was out there. And you can do that over a monthly period, an annual period, and the look back period to kind of annualize it and average it out. But it's really just determining of my balances that are out there, what is the average rate that I'm going to use and trying to annualize that. Aging, like I talked about, that's what we see a lot right now on the 0 to 30 that's past due or what's current. And then I would say the ones for banks and the other complex organizations that have some sophistication. I was raised working on the banks, and I'm more familiar with the PD/LGD. That's the one that makes the most sense to me. But once again, if that's not what's really driving your business, then it may not make sense for the majority of the organizations on this call to go to a PD/LGD model. I think one thing to think about, it also makes sense to do that model if you have something with collateral, because even if you go out and look at Moody's and bond ratings and default rates and things like that, there's a difference between the probability of default, the loss given default, the cumulative loss that happens. And just because something defaults, if there's collateral behind it, it may not have a significant loss that goes along with it, to where if it's more a consumer base where there isn't collateral, default usually leads to a pretty large charge-off as well. So that would be one thing to think about. It's more complex, in my opinion. It may be more accurate. It's the one I was raised with and I like the most. But if you're not a bank or an organization like that, I would expect you would be on the low complexity on aging and loss rate. And I think that's more than appropriate.
Sure. And I think, think about there's, one small nuance here. If you're using a discounted cash flow method for the longer term assets, In terms of recording the way your losses come through, there's two ways to do it, and that digs in pretty far into it. Just know if you're using a discounted cash flow that there's a slight nuance in the guidance as to how you have to record things because you are discounting something back from an actual number.
Great point.
So just keep that in mind for those with long-term assets out there. So jumping into the next piece, determine your historical loss experience. We've talked a little bit about this so far, and this is really your historical loss experience should align with how you pool your assets. That's why the process starts with pooling of the assets. But talk a little bit about like data and kind of accuracy and completeness around that piece.
Yeah. So we really think, and from what we've seen, this is really the most time-consuming and difficult aspect of building this out. And I think people assume, well, I have data, I can go back and pull it, analyze it at any point in time I want to. Maybe true, but I think we also see for organizations that are at least, doing internal control over financial reporting, it's difficult on a certain aspect, and we see errors in current reconciliations or current reports that are being pulled from the current GL or subledgers, let alone what happens to some legacy information that might be 5, 6, 7 years old. And for a number of organizations, I mean, how different are they today than they were 5 to 10 years ago? So the data may be there, but once again, in the world you're living in, whether or not you're in scope for SOX, is that data the right data? Is it complete and accurate? How are you going to prove that it's really there? How are you really going to pull it off of these legacy systems? Will it be detailed and granular enough that you can do it on a loan-by-loan basis with those characteristics that are there, or for your trade receivables, the industry that individual was with? It's going to be more burdensome for everyone than I think they would expect. And I'm just going to, that's where I'll be able to say everyone, and I don't want to use that all the time, but I think this is the appropriate place to say everyone. So I would encourage people to pull that data. It's just like as we start saying, well, AI and data analytics, a lot of organizations have a lot of data, but what can you do with that data?
Yep.
So even if you say, yes, I have 10 years of historical data, I can prove it's complete and accurate. Okay, well, that's great. It's going to take a lot of effort to be able to say that, but then also going from there, how do you analyze that data and break it down with the pools that you think you're going to have for your instrument that's in scope today?
Yes.
So get moving on this. It's going to be much more complex and time-consuming than I think many people bargain for.
Yeah, and while the process starts with the pooling and goes to historical loss experience, you really need to know what your data looks like.
Yep.
Looking at your pools.
Yep.
So to Steve's point, understand your completeness and accuracy of your data. If you want to go with a certain pooling method, do you have the data to support that? Because you cannot go with a pooling method if you do not have the data to support it. So you will have to take a look at your data first, and so that modeling and look back periods and things like that. To Steve's point, it could be a 2-year look back period because you had substantial changes. It could be a 5-year. You might have a 15-year look back period because you've had a steady state business for 15 years.
Sure.
And so keeping in mind, there's a lot of nuances when you're determining your historical loss experience, but there is not one prescribed way to do it.
There isn't.
There's a lot of judgment here, so there's going to be a lot of documentation from entities that are implementing CECL that needs to come around as to why the method you chose makes sense.
Yep.
And a good way to do that is use multiple look back periods. Look at different alternatives. Don't just pick one method and go with it. Let your auditors see that you have been thoughtful about this process instead of just picking one that you think works for you. Look at the other ones and look at the losses and see, does that loss align with the expectations and with that pool?
Great point. I think we can talk about that on almost any slide in this presentation. You have the flexibility to do what you want to do, but no matter what, you have to support why.
Yep.
And for even those organizations that don't think it's going to impact their earnings or balance sheet, you may be right to a certain extent, but I think you're going to have to prove that out on all these different instances, and that will take time.
Yeah.
And then once again, when you're developing this historical loss experience, the better and the more accurate that is, that's really the quantitative building blocks on where your reserve will be built from going forward. And that's where it will be easier for you. It will be less time consuming. Your auditors will ask less questions, because if you have good and the right historical loss experience that reflects your current portfolio and pools today, you won't have to make as many adjustments going forward and maybe not have to forecast and build in some of those qualitative factors going forward where a lot of the judgment comes into play. So the better you can build this foundation through this historical loss experience will benefit and make things more efficient as you go forward.
Absolutely agree. And I think we did actually receive an audience question around, maybe this is a good point to interject. What if you've never had any bad debt or write-offs? How would you address that here? I think my understanding is the FASB says that almost all types of receivables would need some sort of loss percentage on it.
Yep.
That the expectation?
I'm telling you that is the expectation. We talked about U.S. Treasuries that kind of got the zero loss, and that took a lot of time to maybe even think about and get people to buy in on that aspect. Once again, it's always difficult to use always and never, so there may be organizations that never, but once again, why is that? The expectation is on day one, you will record some sort of loss. Now, it might not have to be a very large percentage or basis points of your outstanding receivable, but the expectation will be that you put something there on day one. And that will be that maybe your historical loss experience has shown that can support that you haven't, but how likely in the world in which we're living, or if you think about the credit cycle that we're in today, is this credit cycle like any other credit cycle in the past? Credit cycles, you can see them. If you map it out, it's interesting to see, a credit cycle over, 7 to 10 years and how they go and move over that period. But this is an extended credit cycle. Not all credit cycles have the peaks and valleys that are consistent. And so even though your historical might prove that maybe you don't need much of a reserve, I think when you get to your current state evaluation and your forecasting, that will be very difficult to substantiate going forward, in so much that, once again, the guidance as presented, and I don't think it's going to change very much when it's implemented, will be that you have a loss on day one, unless it's a U.S. type of security.
Yeah, good points. So jumping into the next piece, and we talked a little bit about current supportable, kind of reasonable forecast and bringing that into the process, and now that's a requirement.
Right.
I think a lot of people had that built into their process, but it wasn't part of financial statements because you couldn't bring it in under legacy guidance. But talk a little bit about what that adjustment means and what is reasonable supportable.
Yep. Well, once again, this is a good picture of what I talked about previously on the majority of your reserve should be built upon your historical loss experience to the extent that's possible. So we talked about the data limitations that might present that, but the loss or will even never had a loss. But what about other types of companies in your industry or similar industries? Now, you're not required to go out and look at every type of available information that's out there. In fact, you're not even required to go out and look at external information. However, what I will say is your auditors likely will be, and that's where they'll say, well, your industry is showing or has shown some losses for types of receivables, no matter what they could be, and that will help, or that will be the rationale for why you will build a reserve on day one as you're building this out. So once again, the better you can have this historical information, the less judgment that will be needed to go forward. And there are numerous ways to build these current adjustments and adjustments going forward for your reasonable and supportable forecast. I think when everything was kicking off with this, people thought that a forecast, if it was going out for long-term receivables, could be up to 5 years. But then I think people got a little bit nervous with how accurate that will be and the big swings that could take place in the allowance. Because going back, a lot of organizations like smooth, predictable type of earnings to be out there, and that was one of the ways that the current model was built. This new model, some sort of expectation would be it's going to be big swings from period to period in building your reserve and the impact on earnings.
Yep.
So to think about that, people were saying, well, not only do I not want that, I'm not sure that I can really predict that out going 5 years. So maybe 3 years is a more appropriate forecasting period. And then there's also discussion with organizations, sophisticated organizations like Wells Fargo, who came out and said, I might just do it for 1 year because that's the best I can do to accurately predict something going forward. So this is where judgment can take place. Transparency should be developed so a reader of financials can understand what is taking place. But the judgment factor and the inconsistency with the way that something like this can be built out will hopefully be a small portion of it, but really will be different from organization to organization.
Agreed. I think that's something, one of the questions we had was around how would you bring this into like a trade AR scenario, and I think it's very unlikely